South Africa's President Jacob Zuma is leading a delegation of ministers and business people on a 4-day state visit to China, a visit that is signaling deepening Sino-South African relations. The two sides signed a series of documents on politics, the economy and trade, health and agriculture. Now, this is President Zuma's second state visit to China. 4 years ago, in 2010, when he first visited as South Africa's president, Mr. Zuma and his delegation of ministers and business people signed the declaration on a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. China became South Africa's single largest trading partner in 2009, and South Africa's bilateral trade with China increased by 32% in 2013. Now, experts on China-South Africa trade say China, which has invested in excess of $10 billion in South Africa over the years, sees the country as the gateway to Africa. Now, apart from President Jacob Zuma, Beijing has this year hosted a number of other African heads of state. In October of 2014, President Xi Jinping held talks with President Jakaya Kikwete of Tanzania at the Great Hall of the People. The two leaders spoke highly of the friendship between China and Tanzania and agreed to inherit the past and usher in the future, joining hands to promote the development of China-Tanzania partnership. In August, Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe was in China. According to the Chinese embassy officials in Harare, during the visit, China and Zimbabwe signed 9 bilateral cooperative agreements. Earlier in the year, in February 2014, Senegalese President Macky Sall was in China and together with his host, President Xi Jinping, witnessed the signing of agreements between officials of their delegations at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. While trade underpins the bilateral ties between China and South Africa, which have continued to strengthen since South Africa joined the BRICS grouping, South Africa's Trade and Industry Minister Dr. Rob Davies, who is in the South African delegation to Beijing, reflects on the deepening trade ties between the two countries and what the future holds. He spoke to CCTV Sumitra Naidu shortly before he flew out to China with President Zuma.
What is the real purpose of this visit?
It is to develop a program, an adoptive program for the next 5 years of cooperation between our two countries in a number of areas, but with, I think, a big focus on the economy. And it's to build on the comprehensive strategic partnership agreement which we adopted during the last visit in 2011. So there's a number of aspects to that which are important in our area in trade and investment. But we did agree that there is what we call a structural imbalance in our trade relationship. And that is that our exports to China are dominated by the export of primary mineral commodities, and our imports are a whole lot of value-added products. And so in the last few years, and following the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement, we have been running, with the support of the Ministry of Commerce, value-added trade exhibitions in which we showcase in China and different parts of the country. We showcase value-added products that we can supply into the Chinese market. And we have had some reasonable successes from those, not least in products like wine. We've also been simultaneously seeking to promote investments, and investments both ways. And in fact, if we look at the figures, South Africa total volume of investments is higher than the volume of Chinese investments in South Africa, but there are more Chinese companies involved in South Africa than there are South African companies involved in China. But we have seen some useful growth. Earlier this year, the President was at the opening of the first auto works plant in Kuka Industrial Development Zone. We've also seen Beijing Auto Works establishing a minibus taxi manufacturing facility. And there's quite a number of other Chinese companies that are beginning to move in. So what we want to do is promote a deeper and more value-added focused trade and investment relationship between our two countries.
So even though there is this agreement, we do know that there is a serious imbalance here. And you spoke about the value-added services, value-added products, wine for instance. China just recently signed a free trade deal with Australia, and if you walk into the shops in Hong Kong, for instance, you're going to find only Australian wines. How competitive is South Africa to get onto an equal footing in a place like China, having to compete against places like Australia?
China is now the world's largest market for wine and is one of the fastest, if not the fastest, growing market for wine, but South African wine has been growing faster than the general trend and the trend of imports. And we've been, there's a number of chemical products and some other manufactured goods. What we, I think, would like to do is to see that we're consolidated and deepened. There's a number of agro-processing products, there's a number of other engineering products. We would like the Chinese government to send a delegation to come and look here in South Africa through a buying mission at what we can supply into the Chinese market. Our products are nonetheless competitive. We are putting in place measures to support local manufacturers.
What are some of those measures that you're talking about to support the manufacturing sector?
Well, we have a number of programs. Some of them are sectorally specific and some of them are more generic. But we offer incentives for investment. Some of them take the form of tax credits. You get a holiday on your tax. We offer additional benefits for training and skills development, which is quite critical. We offer different kinds of incentives for different kinds of industries. The automotive industry has its own program. Clothing textile industry has its own program. And we offer something called a manufacturing competitiveness enhancement program, which is to support manufacturers to take steps to raise the competitiveness of their productive facilities here. And then we unashamedly have a localization program which says that government, and including government infrastructure, will procure in defined percentages from locally produced sources. And our ambition is to reach a target of 75% by the end of this administration.
Our membership with the BRICS nations, or with the BRIC nations, how has that worked out for us? Because it seems that it hasn't been so easy, and it's been more beneficial for the BRIC countries as opposed to South Africa.
No, I think that on the contrary, we came into the BRICS at the time when BRICS was beginning to define its own program of internal cooperation, and we've certainly been a significant force in, for example, the emergence of the BRICS New Development Bank. We're looking forward to the establishment of the African Regional Centre at the same time as the bank itself is headquartered in Shanghai. So that will be a very, very important new facility to support infrastructure development, not really in South Africa, but also on the African continent. That, I think, is the real prize that we can gain from that. And then I think there's some very exciting things that part of the architecture of the BRICS is reserve arrangements, so that we can call on each other's reserves if we have balance of payments problems. Also that there are moves to move away from trading third country currencies, so we don't have to turn the rand into dollars and then dollars into renminbi, but we can trade directly without the costs incurred of trading currencies two ways before the transaction is completed. I think those are all things that have been developed within the framework of the BRICS. So the BRICS has been a very positive experience for us. We just handed over the new institution, which was the BRICS Business Council, and I think that during our time in South Africa there was quite a positive step forward in terms of identifying a number of ways in which all of the BRICS countries could cooperate on a number of manufacturing projects.
Well, South African President Jacob Zuma is leading a delegation of government officials and business people to China in search of investments in the manufacturing, energy, agro-processing and mining sectors. And after the break, my guests on the program will take a closer look at the outcomes of the state visit for both South Africa and China. Welcome back to the program. Well, China's cooperation for both South Africa and the African continent has been on more levels than just the economic front. Well, joining us to share the perspective on the program here is Ms. Wu Huxian. She is joining us from Johannesburg. She is a researcher at the South African Institute for International Affairs. And in studio with me is Professor Masharia Munene, Professor of International Relations at the United States International University here in Nairobi. Welcome to the program and thank you. Well, I'm going to start off with you, Ms. Wu. Now, China's President Xi Jinping said during the state visit of President Jacob Zuma that South Africa is the comprehensive and strategic partner of China in Africa. So how strategic has South Africa, though, become for China and why?
If I understand correctly, you're asking about the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. That started in 2010, and from what I understand, I think it's only one of maybe 2 comprehensive strategic partnerships in Africa that China has, and I think in total China has about 11, if I'm not mistaken, in the world. I think what that means is, you know, relations have really expanded and deepened since official diplomatic relations in 1998, and this means that South Africa and China are committed to cooperate at a global multilateral level, and as well as address issues of economic interest that includes both trade and investment.
All right, so you mentioned about relations having deepened in the last few years, though, but what have been the drivers of this relationship?
I think if I have to think about the relationship currently, I think the main driver would be the diplomatic and political level, and of course the economic level. So if we just think about trade from 2012 to 2013, I think it jumped from about something like 205 billion rand to about 270 billion rand. So that's about, according to our trade minister, about 32% jump in a year.
All right, Professor, though we are seeing this enhanced relationship now between South Africa and China, though, and China has said that perhaps South Africa is its gateway to Africa. How do you view, though, the relationship? And they've also talked about President Zuma's visit to China not being, you know, not being an ordinary one.
Yeah, it's the Zuma's second visit to China. It is an important one, because apart from the trade linkages, there are also political ramifications and interests that are at play. Not to forget that they are both members of BRIC, which tries to create its own itself as a major force in global affairs. It's known that South Africa is interested in expanding its nuclear capacity, and China is one of those countries that are interested in helping South Africa enhance its capacity. So there are a lot of things that are going on that will attract both countries. They are both regional powers. South Africa is a regional power in Africa, the largest manufacturer in Africa, and therefore in that sense it can be a gateway into the economic zones. It is also known that South Africa has a lot of reach in other African countries by virtue of itself.
Right.
And so China may want to do that, to use that as an entry, although it does not have to do that, because it has other entry points.
What are the regional issues, though, that are likely to be of mutual interest here to both countries?
Well, I think expansion of manufacturing industries, the common political agenda as to what it is that the region should look like, or how they should play the geopolitical card. When it comes to international challenges, they have a common political approach. They've had that before. And I think that's what President Xi was saying. They are always together. They are a friend at all times, and not just sometimes. And so they can deal with that. Now, President Zuma has his own problems at home. And President Xi is not going to raise those things, right, because they have bigger issues to deal with other than domestic problems of each of the countries.
All right, Ms. Wu, let's just look at what was dominating the talks there between the leaders in China in terms of what China wanted from South Africa and what South Africa was seeking from China. What dominated the talks, though, in Beijing?
I think one of the things to note about South Africa's visit to China is I think it's a challenge for South Africa to balance its role in the region, as we heard, and as well as its domestic and bilateral priorities. So I think that's something that South Africa has to balance carefully. But from what I can understand, Zuma has been accompanied by 7 cabinet ministers. That includes the Minister of Trade, Finance, so they could potentially look at regional and global issues. But it's also, I think, about the bilateral economic relationship, really, because you know, the 5th of December is the South Africa-China Business Forum. So I think they're really looking at Chinese investment into South Africa as well.
They're looking at Chinese investment, but President Jacob Zuma has previously touched on that whole question of trade imbalance, because we know that China's, South Africa's bilateral trade with China increased in 2013 by 32%. But President Zuma has often alluded to the whole question of trade imbalance and saying it may not be sustainable. Is this something that is likely to feature? I mean, how is this being addressed?
I think, you know, this is a complex issue, the issue about the trade imbalance, because, well, first of all, both sides have actually recognized that this is a challenge. I mean, when we talk about an increasing economic relationship and a growing economic relationship, you know, within the space of 10 years of establishing diplomatic ties, China became South Africa's largest trading partner. So it's really accelerated, but, you know, we're trying to make sense of it at the same time. But I do think, you know, it's something both sides recognize, and they establish a joint interministerial group to work on the you know, issues of trade data, because there's different data on both sides actually, and also the imbalance. I think what Zuma is trying to do is also try engage China in areas where, you know, South Africa can actually benefit from through Chinese investment or trade. But I mean, I also, you know, we also have to understand that this is not the only trade imbalance that South Africa faces. With most of our trade partners, it's a similar kind of dynamic. Right. So it's really, you know, about South Africa thinking about how to beneficiate from its product. All right,
but China has been strengthening ties with the rest of Africa as well. And in the wake of the growing investments in Africa, China is also increasingly taking a keen interest in the continent's peace and security. This has necessitated a shift from its traditional non-interference policy to one of engaging with parties to a conflict, as has been witnessed in South Sudan. There are also more and more Chinese peacekeeping troops on African soil operating under the banner of the United Nations. Well, CCTV's Girum Chala now takes a look at how Chinese diplomats have been working with their African counterparts to bring about a more peaceful, stable and secure continent.
Fighting broke out in South Sudan almost a year ago. Ever since, the region and the international community have been trying to broker a peace. But South Sudan isn't out of the woods yet. Time and again, the ceasefire has failed to hold as war continues to ravage Africa's youngest nation. But efforts in search of lasting peace continue, and China has stepped in to play a key role in the process. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, says China's contribution in the search for peace in South Sudan has been instrumental.
China is within the partners of IGAD, working, supporting the IGAD process, and supporting in many ways. They have supported the peace process financially and with the provision of experts, and they are preparing also to send a peacekeeping mission as part of the UNMISS to South Sudan. Hopefully they will arrive before the end of the year, and that's what they are doing, and they are playing a constructive role.
China's representatives have sat around the negotiation table with the aim of helping the warring sides of South Sudan reach a common ground and strike an accord.
Political dialogue is the only option for South Sudan to realize national reconciliation. The two parties should seriously push forward the inclusive national dialogue and reach a solution acceptable to all parties as soon as possible. China firmly supports IGAD for its unwavering efforts and for playing a leading role in mediation in mediating the South Sudan conflicts.
In the search for peace in South Sudan, China's role is not confined round-table negotiations alone. China is preparing to send thousands of peacekeeping troops to the war-torn African nation. Indeed, the African Union and the regional bloc IGAD want China to play a bigger role in Africa's peace and security, and particularly in South Sudan.
China needs to do more because China has hugely invested in South Sudan. Achieving peace is also its direct interest to the Chinese, and they have to use their leverage to assist in the attainance of peace in South Sudan.
1 month ago, regional leaders met in Addis Ababa for a consultative meeting on South Sudan. They gave the warring parties 15 days to form a government of national unity to oversee the transitional process. But like others before it, the parties failed to observe that deadline. For now, it would appear the standoff in South Sudan is way beyond the region itself. IGAD has rightly been calling for robust international support. Many analysts believe Beijing can use its positive influence in Africa to bring peace back to South Sudan. Grumtala, CCTV, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
All right, there's now a determined drive by China to intensify and strengthen their ties with Africa. Ms. Wu, there in Johannesburg, expanding this discussion just slightly, where is the China-Africa relationship now heading, given the fact that this year it's not only been President Zuma who's gone to China, we have seen Senegal's President Macky Sall, among other leaders, also having gone to China this year. Where is the China-Africa relationship now heading?
Well, it's definitely expanding and deepening as time goes by, and I think that's normal for any developing and changing diplomatic relationship. I think the one thing to note about South Africa that makes it quite unique is that up till recently there's actually been more investment into China from South Africa than actually the other way around. So I think when we look at South Africa, we also have to see it as also quite a unique player, because I think in many ways China and South Africa compete with one another. So I think we're going to see this more in terms of South Africa and China-Africa relations. I think that both sides are starting to deal increasingly with issues at hand, such as development on the continent, the trade imbalances as we spoke about, and I think issues, for example, in the last FOCAC in 2012, we saw the Chinese side addressing issues of African concerns of infrastructure or Chinese firms and the adherence to laws and regulations on the continent.
All right, Professor, from your perspective, though, where do you see this China-Africa relationship now heading?
I think the intensification will continue. We note that China, in acting in its own interest, is now deeply involved in peace efforts, and particularly in the Sudan scenario, to ensure, because as long as there is conflict and chaos, it cannot do business. It cannot even balance things as well as it can. So it loses when there are chaos, and so it will be involved in that thing. Now, the nature of that involvement may vary from what other players do. Right. And I think that's where the Chinese niche to try and appear to be different from what other players, outside players, come in. As for the Africans, what do we expect from China? Because it's not a one-way traffic. I think they will continue to need our raw materials, but along with it, we expect more infrastructure, more input in terms of in situ factories and manufacturing and things like that. Instead of just going, there should also be things being left behind for development purposes. But the infrastructure will continue to be a key thing in terms of the relation between various African countries and China.
All right. Politically, though, how are we seeing the dynamics? Is this changing the dynamics now of Africa's international relations?
It strengthens Africa's position in international dealings. Gone are the days when Africa waited to be ordered around, that you have to do this or else, because the or else is losing value. Because it's, the African countries, many of them are increasingly aware of their position, their interests, and are able to project those positions better than they were before. So dealing with China increasingly is from the perspective of Africa's interest, in the same way that dealing with the Western powers is from the perspective of African interest. So when you compare the two, you cut a deal which is best suited to the Africa's position. And I think that's what's going on. It so happens that the coincidence of Africa's interests and Chinese interests is higher than the coincidence or convergence points of Africans' interest and some other countries, which seems to be lower. And that is going to continue to be for the foreseeable future.
All right, Ms. Wu, you have the final word on this. And of course, Africa looks to South Africa as an influential and important voice on the continent. So how is South Africa, though, leveraging these political and economic ties with China for its own benefit and for the benefit of the region?
For the benefits of the region, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a tough position for South Africa in some ways, I think, because they need to balance the interests on the continent as well as their bilateral relationship with China. And I think that's one thing to ask about the FOCAC forum, is whether it is a China-Africa forum or if it's a forum with a set of bilateral relationships. So it's really up to Africa to come up with a common agenda and approach towards China. And I agree with the other speakers that I think what China has done is actually opened up the policy options for Africa. But yeah, I think one thing that probably will benefit the region in terms of FOCAC next year is that we've also seen formal incorporation of the AU as into FOCAC, and this means that possibly FOCAC can move away from a focus on economic development to also addressing issues of peace and security. And I think another thing that's important, I think China can help support South Africa's regional aspirations, because what's good for Africa is also good for South Africa. So for example, this would be building regional infrastructure, and as well as, I think power across the continent is important.
All right, Ms. Wu, we'll leave it there for the moment. Tian Wu, researcher at the South African Institute for International Affairs, joining us there from South Africa, Johannesburg, and Professor Masharia Munene joining us here in studio from the United States International University here in Nairobi. Thank you very much for being on the program. To you both, thank you. I'm Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Goodbye.